Hello everybody, welcome to another session with Safe State. My name's Bev, I'm a child protection lawyer, and today we're going to be looking at part 5 of a history of safeguarding and child protection in the UK. Today we're going to be looking at two cases. One is the case of Kennedy MacFarlane, who lost her life aged 3 on the 17th of May of 2000. And then we're going to have a look very briefly actually at Kate Carman, who also passed away aged 10 weeks in 2000. And then Caleb Ness on the 18th of October 2001 sadly lost his very young life. So let's have a look at these different cases then. So if we have a look at Kennedy MacFarlane, this little angel lived in Dumfries and Galloway, and she was a little girl who, when she was 3 years old, was killed by her mother's boyfriend, Duncan. Kennedy lived with her mum and Thomas Duncan, and in January of 2000, Children's Social Care received a referral from the local playgroup staff, and they noted a marked decline in Kennedy's physical appearance, her mother's very negative attitude towards Kennedy, and in particular a problem that she was having with bedwetting. Now, she was only 3, so it's not unusual that she wouldn't be dry all the way through the night, but apparently this was a real problem for Kennedy's mum. A family social worker visited at that time, but no formal assessment was carried out. And then in March of 2000, so we're only talking a couple of months later, Kennedy suffered quite a serious eye injury. She was taken to the local hospital, and the hospital made a referral to Children's Social Care. And at that stage, the social worker who was assigned the referral deemed that it was not a child protection issue, so no formal assessment was started. Then later on in the same month, in March of 2000, the playgroup staff again voiced their concerns about bruising to Kennedy's face and back pain that she was suffering. So this is a 3-year-old little girl. It's quite unusual for them to suffer from significant back pain. And when we're looking at bruising, obviously any playgroup staff or teachers are mandated reporters. They need to report any child protection concerns they have. But the things that they'd be looking out for with bruising is that it's in the kind of places that children don't naturally get bruises by virtue of everyday childhood accidents. So the likely places that would cause concern would be things like on the ears, on the neck, on the main part of the torso, on the inside of the arms, and on the inside of the thighs. So they're the kind of areas where you'd look at it and think, this isn't a general bump and fall that a child would usually suffer from. So in March, the playgroup staff had voiced the concerns a second time. In April, so a month later, Kennedy suffered from bruising and ataxia, which is a loss of full control of bodily movement. So not something minor. And she'd ingested drugs. So she was admitted to hospital, and a referral was made to the hospital paediatric social worker. And they came and kind of assessed the situation and started to write a report and a referral into children's social care, but didn't finish it until over a month later, by which time, unfortunately, it was too late. And then on the 5th of May of 2000, Kennedy was discharged from the hospital. A social worker started to arrange a case conference, but this wasn't done before her murder. And then on the 17th of May, Kennedy sadly was assaulted by Thomas Duncan. He hit her, leading to her crashing into the leg of the bed. And she suffered from brain and spinal injuries and must have suffered an absolutely agonising death, unfortunately. And it's so hard to think about this sweet little 3-year-old. What could she possibly have done to drive a grown man to behave in the way that he did? He was charged with her murder, and the trial was held at Edinburgh High Court. Thomas Duncan was later found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, because of the case, because of the incident that had happened, Children's Social Care held an inquiry into what had happened, which found that despite the repeated concerns, referrals and admissions, a formal child protection investigation had not been triggered, and nobody had put all the pieces of the puzzle together, creating a total picture of escalating harm within the context of a family in need. Now, this is something that we talk about all the time on this particular channel, is all of the professionals each have a piece of the puzzle. Each family member has got a piece of the puzzle, and it's only when you all sit together and put those pieces together that you get a full picture of what's happening in a child's life on a day-to-day basis. The author of the report said, "I have no doubt that if a joint investigation into all of the circumstances around this little girl had been undertaken from the end of 1999 to early May, there would have been enough evidence already available to satisfy a sheriff of the need to protect her in a place of safety whilst a risk assessment was completed." So what they're basically saying there is there was enough evidence already to remove this child from a position where she was at risk of harm. But because nobody had carried out the assessment, that wasn't acted upon. The report goes on to say that it was a violent death that could not have been accurately predicted, but the murder itself could have been prevented had Dumfries and Galloway Council implemented their full child protection procedures. And the report made some recommendations which are unlikely to shock anybody. They're what we hear on a frequent basis in these inquiries, which is that there should be better partnership working between agencies and improvements in communication, staff supervision, record keeping and documentation. As a result of this case, the Scottish Education Minister, Jack McConnell, announced a review of child protection in Scotland. Now, before that review could take place, there's another incident that we need to look at, which there is very, very limited information available about. So I don't have any pictures. I can't demonstrate for you exactly what happened. But if we just go back actually to Kennedy, we can have a look here at where she was based. So she was in the Dumfries and Galloway area. And we there have a copy of the Child Protection Inquiry report, which came out on the 27th of February of 2001. Now, before we talk about Caleb, we need to just very briefly touch on Kate Carman. She passed away in 2000. I haven't been able to find the exact date, and the paucity of information about this young baby who passed away is really concerning to me. How are we ever going to learn from these things if the information about what happened isn't available to the public? So Kate Carman was 10 weeks old. Both parents blamed the other for what happened to her. And what I can tell you is that this little 10-week-old baby had 35 broken bones and her liver had been ruptured. That is a significant amount of injury, and it's unlikely to have come in the form of one incident. I mentioned that Jack McConnell announced a review of child protection in Scotland, and that was released in 2001, and it was called "It's Everybody's Job to Make Sure I'm All Right." And the results of that inquiry were not published until 2003. So we're skipping ahead a bit of time here, but just for the sake of completeness, because this is when it started as a result of the Kennedy-MacFarlane inquiry. It made 17 recommendations focusing on 7 areas for improvement. And it found that half of all children at risk of abuse and neglect in the country failed to receive adequate protection. National implementation teams were established to support local agencies in improving child protection arrangements as a result of that inquiry. 2 years later, there was a children's charter published, and that set out how carers and professionals should protect and respect children's rights. So if we then look at Caleb Ness was 11 weeks old when on the 18th of October 2001 he was shaken so violently by his father that he passed away. But let's look at the family background first of all. So his mother was Shirley Malcolm. She had 20 years of substance addiction issues. She was involved in prostitution and a high level of criminal activity. And she'd had 2 older children removed from her care. Now, I am in no way judging that somebody chooses to work in the sex worker industry in any way. But when you mix that and the potential risks involved in that type of work with being a parent and the other issues that Shirley was facing, it then makes it much more difficult to meet your child's needs. Caleb's father was Alexander Ness. and he had a history of very violent offences against adults. He'd been in prison for drug dealing and had served most of a 5-year sentence when he was released in mid-2000. So in the autumn of 2000 is when this couple met, and by the end of the year, Shirley was pregnant with Caleb. She didn't disclose the pregnancy to any professionals. She didn't seek antenatal care, which means that she isn't prioritising the needs of that baby. And she took her methadone prescription throughout the pregnancy, which could, of course, result in the child being born with a dependency on the substance. His father also suffered some brain damage some months before Caleb was born, which will no doubt have impacted on his ability to safely parent. On the 30th of July of 2001, Caleb Ness was born. On the 9th of August of 2001, there was an initial child protection conference because the authorities became aware of his birth, and he was placed on the child protection register. And at 10 days old, he was allowed to go home from the hospital with his mum. The position of the family at that time was that the parents weren't living together, but the father would be regularly visiting the house. So the authorities knew that this child was at risk of significant harm. And there are some very serious risks in this scenario. But they allowed him to go home with these parents. And then on the 18th of October of 2001, aged 11 weeks, emergency services were called because Caleb had been injured, and he was admitted to the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. A post-mortem was carried out and found that he had really widespread fresh hemorrhaging in all compartments of the brain, that he'd suffered a rapid death following a traumatic injury, probably caused by rough shaking of the baby. He had 14 definite rib fractures, 3 of which were in 3 different stages of healing. So some were new, some were 7 to 10 days old, and some were several weeks old. So this baby has had rib fracture after rib fracture after rib fracture at different times. Now, anybody who's had a fractured rib knows it is excruciatingly painful. Now imagine being young enough that you don't understand what's happened to you and why the people who are supposed to protect you beyond anything else in the world are treating you in a way that means that you're in agony afterwards. So the post-mortem came to the conclusion that there had been a minimum of 3 separate episodes of trauma to his chest, probably by gripping and shaking. Alexander Ness, Caleb's father, the one person who should have protected this beautiful baby, his daddy, was charged with his murder. He pleaded not guilty and it was listed for a trial. He then changed his plea to a guilty plea of culpable homicide by reason of diminished responsibility due to brain injury. And in March of 2003 he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, which, for the brutality of what he did to this little baby, seems nowhere near enough. There was an inquiry as a result of the incident, because it was the death of a child, that was undertaken by Edinburgh and Lothian's Child Protection Committee and was led by Susan O'Brien, Queen's Counsel. And the inquiry found this, that neither parent should have had unsupervised care of that child. There was background information that wasn't available at the initial Child Protection Conference, that a detailed child protection plan had not been agreed, that there was a failure to undertake a rigorous risk assessment or to coordinate regular visits to the child after his release from hospital with the parents, that there was a lack of supervision and management oversight of the social worker involved, that the agencies were not working together, so each was holding a bit of the puzzle. Nobody could see the full picture. Professionals had made assumptions about knowledge, training and actions of the workers involved, and that workers were confused about what they could and couldn't share due to confidentiality, and that in particular related to the treating psychologist of one of the parents. There was a lack of training, a lack of clear lines of accountability. The death was avoidable. The clues to preventing his death were available to officials. There were faults at almost every level in every agency involved, and there was no single individual who could be held responsible, but that communication between agencies must be improved. The recommendations from that report were that all 342 children on the Child Protection Register of Edinburgh City Council should be reviewed, that a review of the social work department must take place, that the social work department must be reorganised, and it also set into motion a series of initiatives for modernising the child protection system in Edinburgh. It improved training, improved communication, and created better ways of sharing information. So you can see here the area in the United Kingdom where Caleb lived and where this incident occurred. And I'll leave you with some quotes from some of the people involved. So council leader Donald Anderson said this: "Clearly there was a wave of shock and horror in the council and other agencies as we read and considered the conclusions in the report, in what is quite frankly a devastating report into the childcare procedures. This is about the way the service was delivered on the ground, and there have been appalling failures in the way that the care of Caleb Ness was handled on the ground, and that's what we have to put right. I'd like to personally apologise And then we had Professor James Barber, who was from NHS Lothian, And he said this: "I'd like to personally apologise on behalf of NHS Lothian for any failings in our systems and our communication which may have contributed in any way to Caleb's death." And the Deputy Minister for Young People, Ewan Robson, said that lessons would be learned and would form part of the Scottish Executive's plans for reform of child protection laws. So we've got three really senior people there who are apologising, but really it's too little too late for Caleb and for his family. And then I'll mention one other case that there's so limited information. I can only tell you that there was a young child called Danielle Jones who in 2001 was sadly killed by her uncle Stuart Campbell, who was infatuated with her. And again, the paucity of information. How can we learn from these things if we can't even find information about them? And that's all from me for today. So thank you for watching. Thank you to everyone who subscribes, who takes the time to listen. I really appreciate you. But if you can, please take a moment to like, subscribe, share, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about these cases. And also let me know about any other cases that you'd like to hear more about. And remember, if you see something, please say something. And it just remains to say, please take care of yourselves and each other. See you next time.